Good morning, dear learners. Myself, Dr. Bhaskar Sharma, Assistant Professor Economics from Krishnakanta Handicap State Open University, Guwahati, Assam. Welcome to this MOOC on Indian economy, policy and environment, titled Growth and Development in India, Trends and Issues. And this is part of the first module, Understanding Development. So the structure of the unit is like this. We have first a brief introduction, then learning objectives, then a brief account of GDP estimation in India, trends of GDP and per capita income in India, trends of saving and investment in India, synthesizing India's growth trajectory with learning economic growth theories. Then we shall be looking at the sectoral composition of India's GDP, then contribution of agriculture, industry and services sectors to employment generation, and then also we will also evaluate the role of the state in economic development and its key features of the Indian economy, and then we will summarize the module and we will also look into the references and suggested reading. So as I have already said, this is the first module of the MOOC titled Indian Economy, Policy and Environment. The title of this video is Growth and Development in India, Trends and Issues. Dear learners, in the first video, we have discussed a brief theoretical ground on understanding approaches to economic development. There we discussed three basic approaches to economic development, namely economic growth, human development, and sustainable development. In this video, we shall try to examine performance of the Indian economy in terms of economic growth since independence. In this context, we shall basically be looking at the trends and phases of economic growth, various drivers of economic growth, sectoral composition of economic growth, and briefly about their contributions in generating employment in the economy. Further, based on the trends of economic growth, saving and investment, and synthesis between India's growth trajectory and leading economic growth theories has also been examined. We shall then briefly evaluate the role of the government in economic development. And finally, we shall also look at the features of the Indian economy, how they have transitioned over the period of time. The learning objectives of this module are to examine performance of the Indian economy in terms of economic growth since independence, to trace the various drivers of economic growth, to analyze sectoral composition of economic growth, and briefly about the contributions in generating employment in the economy, to synthesize the growth trajectory of the Indian economy with leading theories of economic growth, to briefly evaluate the role of the government in economic development, and to look at the features of the Indian economy, how they have transitioned over the period of time. Now, a brief account of GDP estimation in India. In India, Dadabhai Naoroji first estimated national and per capita income for 1867-68. Early attempts by private individuals and officials confronted serious challenges in acquiring reliable data for pre-independence estimates, leading to assumptions based on macro-level data. Accurate statistics emerged only post-independence in 1947, attempting a systematic approach. In 1949, the National Income Committee, NIC, was established, headed by Professor P.C. Mahalanobis, with members including Dr. D.R. Gadgil and V.K.R. Rao. The National Income Unit, NIU, assisted the NIC in compiling estimates. The first report appeared in 1951, with the final report published in 1954. Initially, under the Ministry of Finance, the NIU transitioned to the Central Statistical Organization, CSO, which has since taken full responsibility for national income estimates. Since 1955, the CSO publishes annual data on India's national income in National Account Statistics, enabling analysis of trends in national and per capita income. Now let us look at the trends of GDP and per capita income in India. Numerous studies are found on discussion of India's GDP growth after independence, identifying clear stages and patterns. Broadly, we can identify four patterns of economic growth in India. First, 1951 to 1979, which shows a modest and fluctuating growth. Second, 1980 to 1999, which shows faster and more stable economic growth. Third, 2000 to 2016, which showed accelerated growth. And fourth, 2007 to 2023, which shows economic slowdown, pandemic, and recovery. Now, from table 2.1, we can see these growth patterns of gross domestic product (GDP) and GDP per capita (GPC), as shown for the period 1950 to 51 to 2020-21 at 5-year intervals, including the recent years. Please note that the data is based on the 2011-12 constant price series. So here we can see the data in table 2.1 is showing trend of growth of India's GDP and GPC, at the constant prices of 2011-12. And here in figure 1, we can see overall trends of annual growth rates of GDP at constant prices of 2011-12. And in figure 2, we can see overall trends of annual growth rates of GPC at constant prices of 2011-12. So from table 2.1 shows India's GDP and GPC growth rates in the initial years as low and variable, averaging at 3.5%. This period, known as the Hindu rate of growth, saw sluggish development from independence until the 1980s. Renowned researchers, including Robert Lucas, compared these rates with other Asian nations during 1947 to 87. He said, "Is there some action a government of India could take that would lead the Indian economy to grow like Indonesia's or Egypt's? If so, what exactly? If not, what is it about the nature of India that makes it so?" The consequences for human welfare involved in questions like these are simply staggering. Once one starts to think about them, it is hard to think about anything else. He said it in 1988. So in his analysis, Lucas found that India's GDP per capita increased only 0.8 times over 4 decades, averaging at 1.6% annually. Similar to the findings of Basu and Merton's 2007 analysis for the years 1950 to 1970. However, from the mid-1970s to the 1980s, growth picked up, averaging at about 6% from 1980 to 2005. This average continued in the 1990s and rose to 7% in the 2000s. Now, growth moderated to around 6 to 7% from 2010 to 2020 due to global slowdowns and domestic challenges. After a contraction in 2020 due to COVID-19, India rebounded with 8 to 9% growth rates in 2021. Significantly, despite these gains, India's global GPC ranking stagnated or declined from 1950 to 2018, as noted by Ryan Berman in 2022, as can be seen from table 2.2. So here is the table 2.2, and we can see that India's rank in GPC among select countries of the world during the period 1950 to 2018. So table 2.2 highlights India's ranking at 115th among 145 nations in 1950, which later deteriorated from 1960s to 1980s. Gradual improvement led India back to the 115th position in 2018. Ryan Berman contend that the Indian experience revealed that while challenges remain, rapid and sustainable growth is possible. In the next session, we will analyze trends in domestic saving and investment in India, as these are crucial for conceptualizing economic growth, which are building blocks to various growth theories, including the Harrod-Domar model. Dear learners, we know that gross domestic saving as a percentage of GDP provides insight into the saving behavior of households, business, and the government. Similarly, gross domestic capital formation, GDCF, indicates the total investment in the economy, including public and private investments. Table 2.3 summarizes the GDS and GDCF as a percentage of GDP from the 1950s till the recent times. So here is in table 2.3, you can see gross domestic saving and gross domestic capital formations as a percentage of GDP for the year 1950 to 2023. From table 2.3, it can be seen that in the 1950s, post-independence India had a low growth domestic saving, GDS, rate below 10% of GDP, reflecting its low productivity agrarian economy and limited financial tools. Government initiatives like the National Savings Certificate helped raise GDP to 11% by 1960, further increasing it to 14% by 1970 due to the Green Revolution and improved rural income. By 1980, the GDS is 70%, influenced by economic policies and private sector expansion. By 1960, it increased to approximately 15%, reaching about 16% by 1970. By 1980, it was about 20%. The 1990s saw GDCF increasing to 26%, peaking at above 33% in 2010, which later fell below 28% in 2020 due to the pandemic. Recent estimates indicate a recovery to about 30% in 2023, showcasing the impact of government policies on growth and investment. The post-1980 liberalization and reform stabilized GDS above 20%, climbing to around 25% after the 1991 reforms and peaking at 37% in 2010. GDP has deteriorated during COVID-19 pandemic period, which has now been overcome. We know gross domestic capital formation represents total investment within an economy, combining public and private contributions. The gross domestic capital formation initially was above 11% in 1950s due to public investment in infrastructure and agriculture. Now let us try to synthesize India's growth trajectory with leading economic theories. As already mentioned, India's GDP growth has intrigued economists and policymakers, prompting analysis through diverse economic development theories. This section will explore India's growth trajectory using the Harrod-Domar model, Lewisian theory of structural transformation, and Rostow's stages of economic growth theory. So let us begin with the Harrod-Domar model of economic development. As you know, the Harrod-Domar model, developed by Roy Harrod and F.C. Domar, highlights the significance of saving and investment in economic growth, determining nation's GDP growth rate through its saving rate and capital up ratio. India's GDP growth can be evaluated using this model by analyzing its saving and investment trends. Notably, two 5-year plans in India incorporated this model. The first 5-year plan, which was implemented during 1950 and 56, was predominantly based on it, while the 6th 5-year plan, which was implemented during 1980 and 85, combined it with input-output accounting. Now, India's gross saving rate rose from 9% of GDP in 1950 to over 29% in 2020, driven by increased household savings from a growing middle class and better access to financial services, facilitating greater investment and GDP growth. This shows working of the model in the economy. Now let us examine the working of the Lewisian theory of structural transformation in the Indian economy. The Lewisian theory of structural transformation proposed by W. Arthur Lewis highlights how structural changes propel economic growth. It posits that growth stems from reallocating labor from low productivity sectors like agriculture to high productivity sectors like manufacturing and services. India's economy reflects this transformation, with agriculture GDP share dropping from 50% in 1950-51 to 60% by 2016-17. Conversely, manufacturing rose from 18% to 26% and services from 28 to 40%, boosting productivity and income levels. And we can see this from figure 2.3. Now, Rostow's theory of stages of economic growth emphasizes the role of technological progress and institutional change in driving economic growth. According to this theory, economic growth occurs in 5 stages: traditional society, preconditions for take-off stage, then drive to maturity, and high mass consumption. Now, India's economy can be seen as having progressed through the first 3 stages of Rostow's theory. The country has initially moved from a traditional society to a preconditions for take-off stage, then characterized by development of infrastructure and institutions. The country has then entered the take-off stage, characterized by rapid industrialization and urbanization. India is currently in the drive to maturity stage, according to this theory, characterized by the development of a diversified economy and growth of a middle class. The above analysis of India's GDP growth through the theoretical lenses, like the ones we have already discussed above, can help policymakers gain a deeper understanding of the drivers of economic growth and develop policies to promote sustainable and inclusive growth. Now, dear learners, let us look at the sectoral composition of India's GDP. The sectoral composition of India's GDP, gross domestic product, has undergone significant changes since the country gained independence in 1947. This has also resulted in marked changes in the role and contributions of the different sectors in the economy. This can be viewed from figure 2.2, where it can be seen the changing trend from 1950-51 to 2016-17. Further, table 2.4 shows the percentage shares for the 3 economic sectors of gross value added from 2011-12 to 2023-24 at a constant price level of 2011-12. Dear learners, please note that the data in figure 2.3 and table 2.4 are not directly comparable due to science in base share and also science in the methodologies. One can refer standard Indian economy textbook like the Dutt and Sundaram's Indian Economy 73rd edition for a detailed discussion on this issue. Now, this is figure 2.3. It shares the share of the three major sectors of the economy in GDP from 1950 till 2016-17. And here is that table 2.4. It shows the percentage share of gross value added (GVA) by defined economic sectors for 2011-12 to 2023-24, which basically provisional estimates, and the base year is 2011-12. So the data presented in figure 2.3 and table 2.4 indicate a significant decline in the agriculture sector's contribution to GDP, decreasing from 50% in 1950-51 to below 20% by 2016-17. Its share in GVA, gross value added, also fell from 15.5% in 2011-12 to 15.1% in 2019-20, although it temporarily increased during the COVID-19 pandemic period before declining again. In contrast, the industrial sector's share in GDP remained relatively stable from less than 20% in 1950 to just over 25% in 2016-17, and also in terms of GVA from 32.5% to around 31% in 2023-24. The services sectors experienced remarkable growth, rising from less than 30% of GDP in 1950-51 to just under 50% by 2016-17, and with GVA contribution increasing from 49% in 2011-12 to over 55% in 2019-20, despite a decline during the pandemic. Many argue that this transformation reflects India's shift away from agricultural reliance, typically of developing economies, but with a notable lack of manufacturing growth, setting the country apart from other nations. So in South Asia, if you look in South Asia, particularly India, the services sector's productivity has notably risen, aligning with countries like China and Thailand, thereby supporting robust economic growth. When we analyze the key driving factors for such transition, we notice certain significant trends within the three broad economic sectors. Like between 1950 and 1960, the agricultural sector's share in GDP declined due to an initial focus on industrialization and consequent labor shifts. In the later years, urbanization and services sector growth further contributed to this decline. We also see that despite a rising share from the industrial sector over time, the rapid expansion of the services sector overshadowed it. Interestingly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the tertiary sector's contribution decreased, while the primary and secondary sector saw an uptick. Overall, India's economy has experienced a profound transformation with noteworthy shifts in GDP composition, primarily led by services, whereas the industrial sector influence has grown only modestly. The liberalization policies introduced in the early 1990s, and particularly since 1991, have intensified this metamorphosis, fostering a more diversified economy. The forthcoming section will explore the role of these three sectors in employment generation within the economy, shedding further light on the contributions and significant driving growth and development. Now let us look at the contributions of agriculture, industry and services to employment generation. We have seen in the previous section that at the time of independence, agriculture has been the major contributor to India's GDP, which continued till the mid-1980s. Even now, agriculture employs the largest portion of labor force in the economy. Traditionally, agriculture has been the major source of earning for the Indian population. The trend of employment by the different sectors of the economy since the economic reforms of 1991 till 2022 has been shown with the help of figure 2.4. So in figure 2.4, you can see the share of agriculture, industry and services employment during the years 1991 to 2022. So in figure 2.3, we see that agriculture continues to be the largest employer, employing over 60% of the labor force in 1991, though this figure has declined to above 50% by 2022. It is to be noted here that prior to the 1991 economic reforms, initiatives like the Green Revolution increased agricultural productivity without significantly reducing employment. Meanwhile, the share of the other sectors have risen during this period. Post-reform, the rise of the private and services sectors has boosted their employment shares, leading to the service sector becoming dominant, influenced by globalization and growing middle class. Recent initiatives like Make in India and Skill India seek to enhance job creation. This section outlines the employment trends across the three economic sectors with further discussion planned. Now let us look at the role of the state in economic development, what role the state played during this period since 1947. Since gaining independence, the state has played a crucial role in India's economic development, beginning with a socialist strategy under Jawaharlal Nehru that focused on state control over key industries like steel and coal. This approach sought to combat poverty and reconstruct the post-colonial economy, making headway through initiatives like the five-year plans. Notably, the second five-year plan targeted heavy industrial establishment and advocated import substitution to reduce reliance on foreign goods. However, the centralized state's ownership and control over resources have faced criticisms. In fact, many viewed the Planning Commission as a mechanism of translating states' such character of accumulation of direct ownership of resources and control in the economy. For example, noted economist Pranab Bardhan highlighted inefficiencies arising from bureaucratic process and misallocation of resources due to the government's political priorities overshadowing economic efficiency. He pointed to the informal sector's essential role, which was often overlooked, urging reforms through decentralization and public-private partnerships to foster entrepreneurship and economic growth. To foster entrepreneurship and equitable growth. Now, government's policy initiatives in traditional sectors like agriculture, like the Green Revolution, boosted productivity notably, yet the small farmers often remain neglected, highlighting rural development issues. Further, by the 1980s, the state shifted towards a liberalized economy with significant reforms in 1991 that spurred private investment and foreign competition, leading to a notable growth, especially in the services sector. Despite India's impressive GDP growth, challenges such as jobless growth, stagnant human development, and regional disparities persist, indicating ongoing struggles to achieve equitable progress. Overall, the evolution of the state's role reflects a transition from heavy control to liberalization, establishing India as a major economic power with facing persistent socio-economic challenges. Now, having said this, now let us look at the key features of the Indian economy, how they have changed over a period of time. The Indian economy has undergone significant transformation since independence in 1947, evolving from an agrarian society to one of the world's rapidly growing economies characterized by distinct phases of economic policies and reforms. So in phase one, if you say, in the early economic policies in 1950s and 1980s, this period saw the establishment of a mixed economic model that integrated capitalism and socialism with extensive government involvement in economic planning to foster self-reliance. This strategy of import substitution industrialization, ISI, aimed to minimize reliance on foreign goods by protecting domestic industries via tariffs and quotas, resulting in the launch of numerous public sector enterprises. The Planning Commission introduced five-year plans focusing primarily on agriculture, irrigation, and infrastructure while imposing stringent regulations on private sector, foreign trade, and investments. Now, phase 2. This includes the early years of economic liberalization of 1991 till 2000. The early 1990s marked a significant turning point participated by a severe balance of payment crisis. Under Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, the government introduced the new economic policy which embraced liberalization, privatization, and globalization. We call it in BF LPG. Now, key reform measures undertaken under NEP included structural adjustments such as rupee devaluation and tariff reductions, fostering a surge in average annual growth rates to about 6% during the 1990s. Notably, the services sector, particularly IT and BPO, emerged as pivotal growth drivers, significantly contributing to GDP and employment. And in phase 3, growth and development phase, you can see during the period 2000 to till now. Now, in the current global environment, the Indian economy faces numerous challenges such as volatility in global markets, inflationary pressures, and structural inequality, requiring strategic responses to sustain growth and development. Now, if we see the high growth rates, following liberalization, India has achieved impressive economic growth, averaging 6 to 8% annually during the 2000s, driven largely by the services sector, especially IT and software. Structural reforms. Key reforms such as the Goods and Services Tax (GST) and Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code (IBC) were introduced to enhance the business environment and tackle banking sector challenges. So sectoral diversification. What we see, the economy has diversified into a commerce, digital payments, and renewable energy, making shift toward a more modern economic structure. And rising middle class, economic expansion has fostered a significant middle class, boosting domestic consumption and impacting sectors like retail, housing, and education. Another feature of the Indian economy now is digital economy. India is witnessing a digital revolution with substantial investments in technology, fueled by initiatives like Digital India aimed at enhancing digital literacy and access. And sustainable growth. The emphasis is on sustainable development through investment in renewable energy, green technologies, and sustainable agriculture practices. Now, if you look at the challenges, there are certain key challenges in the Indian economy because despite its impressive growth, it faces significant challenges that also highlights key features. That means these challenges are also becoming a key feature of the Indian economy. These include persistent inequality and poverty, with a large part of the population living below and poverty line and ongoing regional development disparities. Environmental sustainability poses another challenge as industrialization strains ecological balances, requiring a careful blend of growth and protection. Additionally, the post-COVID recovery remains a priority as the pandemic caused a GDP contraction, prompting the government to introduce stimulus measures aimed at infrastructure development and job creation to revitalize the economy. Now, let us summarize the model, what we have discussed so far. So, we have discussed that in India, the first national income estimates were made in 1867-68 by Dadabhai Naoroji. Since 1955, the CUSO has provided annual official estimates in national accounts statistics in a more systematic way. India's economic growth has followed four patterns: 1951 to 59, modest and fluctuating; 1980 to 1999, faster and stable; 2000 to 2016, accelerated growth; and 2017 to 2023, slowdown due to pandemic impacts, followed by recovery. From 1947 to 1980s, the average economic growth rate was 3.5% annually, the Hindu rate of growth as you call it, with a per capita growth of 1%. The 1990s saw an average rate of 6%, rising to 7 to 8%, but COVID-19 caused a temporary contraction with recovery in 2021. Factors like rising saving, agricultural investment, and financial development set the stage for reforms in the 1990s. And since 1947, India evolved from an agrarian society to a growing economy, driven by policy changes and structural shifts. The state's role in India's economic development post-independence has been pivotal, characterized by a transition from a heavily state-controlled economy to a more liberalized market, wherein the economy now is more prone to global shocks like the global economic recession of COVID-19 pandemic, etc. While in the post-reform era, significant progress has been made, challenges such as job creation, human development, and regional disparities continue to necessitate a balanced approach that integrates economic growth with social equity and sustainable development. So with this, we conclude this unit, and we shall continue our discussion on this in the next unit number 4. Thank you, and we meet you in the next presentation with the unit development indicators of module 2, which is basically unit 4. Thank you.